She found the divorce papers on a Wednesday morning, already signed. She was 10 weeks pregnant, and she never got to tell him. Within 6 weeks, he had taken everything. Her studio, her reputation, her name on every asset they had built together. She moved into a $680 a month apartment in January. She miscarried alone. She told no one. 18 months later, a man walked into her office in Nashville, tall, unhurried, worth more than she could calculate. He wanted her to restore an old estate called Moore. She said yes. What she didn't know, what she couldn't yet know, was that he had been watching her for over a year, that he had chosen her deliberately, that she was never supposed to be the architect. She was supposed to be the weapon. The divorce papers arrived on a Wednesday, which was the kind of mundane detail Serena Calloway Hargrove would remember for the rest of her life, because mundane details were the ones that embedded deepest, like splinters working inward rather than out. It was not a Monday, with all its operatic portent. It was not a Friday, soft with the promise of escape. It was a Wednesday, the hinge of the week, a day designed for nothing except continuing, and the papers came in a manila envelope that had been placed, not delivered, on the kitchen island of their Lakeshore Drive penthouse while she was in the shower. She knew Dominic had placed it there because the envelope had not been opened, not been crumpled in transit, not been touched by anyone except the person who intended it to be found exactly where it was. Clean, deliberate, geometrically precise in its position at the center of the Calicotta marble surface. She stood in her bathrobe and read it twice. The second time, she noticed his signature was already on the last page. He had not left a pen. She was 10 weeks pregnant. She had been planning, for 3 days, the exact way she would. She had even rehearsed 2 versions, one for a night he came home happy, one for a night he came home distracted. She had contingency plans for his emotional responses, the way she had contingency plans for structural assessments. Always account for the load you cannot see. She never told him what Serena understood about Dominic Hargrove in the first minutes of reading those papers was something she had understood peripherally for 2 years but had refused to look at directly. The way you learn not to look directly at the sun even when you know the sun is there. That she had never been a person to him. She had been a position, a category of asset he had moved into the portfolio of his life with the same methodical efficiency with which he moved capital, appreciating for a time. And then, when the calculus shifted, liquidated. He was not cruel in the theatrical sense. He didn't slam doors or raise his voice or arrive home smelling of someone else's perfume. He was crueler than that. He was precise. And precision, Serena would come to understand, was the most devastating form of dismissal available to a human being, because it left no room for misinterpretation. You could not argue with a clean signature on the last page of a document. There was no ambiguity to grip. She called her sister Elena once that evening and said only that she needed a few days, that everything was fine, that she would explain later. She did not explain. She did not explain for 3 months, and by the time she did, the miscarriage was already part of the past. She had locked into the load-bearing structure of herself, not hidden, exactly, but built into the foundation where no one would think to look. Dominic Hargrove, 38. Co-founder and principal of Hargrove Axiom, a private equity firm with holdings in aerospace, biotech, and media. Operating from a glass tower on Wacker Drive that caught the lake wind and hummed, moved through the dissolution of his marriage the same way he moved through all businesses, with compartmentalization so thorough it bordered on physiological. He did not explain himself to his partners. He did not discuss Serena with his attorney beyond what was operationally necessary. He attended a charity gala on Michigan Avenue 3 weeks after serving papers, in a charcoal suit, and was photographed laughing at something the Illinois governor said. What Dominic understood about leverage was this: the first thing you remove is the thing that makes the other party feel they have options. Options were a form of power. You took the options and you took the power and you took them quietly, through mechanisms that couldn't be traced back to intention, only to circumstance. The Wicker Park townhouse, which Serena had loved with a specificity that embarrassed her in retrospect. She had loved the way morning light fell across the pine floors in the kitchen, had loved the architectural bones of it. Its 1920s proportions was held under a shell LLC that, Serena had signed paperwork for during what had been presented to her as a routine financial restructuring in the spring. She hadn't read it carefully enough. She would not make that mistake again, but the recognition of that came too late to help her now. The LLC transferred the property seamlessly. She was informed by a paralegal via email. Her architectural design studio, Callaway Design, which she had built from a single residential commission into a practice with 4 employees and a reputation for sensitive restoration work that was beginning to attract attention from the kinds of institutional clients who made careers, was blacklisted within 4 weeks of the filing. She didn't understand how at first projects she had been shortlisted for went silent. A preservation commission she had been the preferred candidate for awarded its contract to a firm in Milwaukee that had never worked in Illinois. An associate told her, quietly, that there had been conversations, that someone had made calls. She could not prove who. She would later be able to prove it, but later was too late for the studio, which she shuttered in February with 2 months of back salary owed to her staff that she paid out of her personal savings. She moved to a $680 a month studio apartment in Pilsen in late December. It was on the 3rd floor of a building that had once been a factory and had been imperfectly converted, which meant the heating was inconsistent and the windows rattled when the wind came off the lake at the wrong angle. She noticed, professionally, that the east wall had a moisture problem that the building management had addressed by painting over it. She said nothing about this to anyone. She bought a space heater and positioned it in the bathroom, which was the smallest room and the one that retained heat most efficiently. On a January night when the temperature dropped to 11 degrees and the space heater in the bathroom was making a sound like a distant argument, Serena miscarried alone on the cold tile floor. She was 12 weeks by then. She stayed on the floor for a long time after, not because she couldn't move, but because moving felt like a decision that required an energy she didn't currently have access to. She thought, briefly, about calling someone. She thought about calling Elena. She thought about calling a number she still had in her phone under the initial D, which she had not yet deleted because deleting it felt like a gesture toward healing she wasn't ready to perform. She called no one. She cleaned the bathroom. She went to bed. She told no one about the miscarriage. Not that night, not the next day, not for a long time afterward. It felt, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, like the last thing that was entirely hers. A private accounting. A grief that belonged to no narrative except her own. What she felt in the months that followed was not grief, exactly, or not only grief. Grief was a weather system. It moved through, it changed conditions, it eventually cleared. What settled in her after January was something different. Clarity. The kind of clarity you got when you stripped a building down to its framing and saw exactly which walls were holding weight and which ones were just decoration. She saw herself with that kind of clarity. She saw what she had allowed, what she had overlooked, what she had signed without reading, what she had called love when it was closer to proximity. She was not bitter. Bitterness required ongoing investment. What she felt was closer to architectural certainty. She knew what she was working with now. Load-bearing walls first, ornamentation last. Everything else was just material. She existed again under a different configuration. Serena Callaway, her mother's name restored, her married name surgically removed, was 33 and based in Nashville, Tennessee, working as a junior restoration architect at a historic preservation firm on Charlotte Avenue called Breyer plus Hollis. The firm occupied the ground floor of a converted 1940s commercial building, its exposed brick walls unplastered, its high windows admitting a particular quality of Tennessee light that was softer and more golden than Chicago light, less aggressive, more patient. She had taken the job because it was competent work with ethical partners and because Nashville was far enough from Chicago to feel like a different atmosphere entirely, but close enough geographically, culturally, that it didn't feel like flight. She was good at her work. She was methodical, creative within unflinching in her assessment, and exactly as warm as the situation required, no more. Her colleagues liked her in the way people liked someone they found both admirable and slightly opaque. She went to the office holiday party and stayed for exactly 90 minutes. She knew the names of everyone's children. She did not discuss her own history. She had rebuilt herself the way she once restored broken buildings, load-bearing walls first, and everything else in its proper sequence. Nothing cosmetic applied until the structural integrity was. She had a small apartment in East Nashville near a coffee shop she went to every morning, a used car she didn't love but trusted, and a therapist she had seen twice and then stopped seeing because a therapist kept trying to locate blame externally, and Serena was not interested in blame. She was interested in function. There was a difference. She had not been on a date since Chicago. She had not wanted to. He walked into Briar Plus Hollis on a Tuesday afternoon in September, and Serena was in the conference room with blueprints spread across the central table when her colleague, Marcus, knocked and opened the door and said, with the slightly elevated register people used when the financial stakes of a meeting had been communicated to them in advance, that Mr. Lane was here. Everett Lane was 44 and tall, in the way that seemed less about height than about economy of movement. Everything he did appeared considered, unhurried, in a way that was not slowness, but restraint. The restraint of someone who had learned that most situations resolve themselves if you decline to escalate them. He wore a dark linen shirt and carried nothing, except the kind of watchful stillness that made you aware you were being assessed without feeling examined. His eyes were gray-green and direct. He did not smile when he entered the room. Neither did she. Good, she thought, before she could stop herself. He sat across the table from her and her partner Daniel and laid out, with precise brevity, what he wanted: the restoration of Aldenmore, a 19th century estate property he had purchased outside Franklin, Tennessee, approximately 30 miles south. The estate was a federal-style main house with 2 dependency structures, a carriage house and a kitchen. Outbuilding, all in varying states of deterioration. He wanted the restoration to be architecturally honest. No false reconstruction, no period theater. Where material was lost, he wanted the loss documented rather than disguised. Where structural failure had occurred, he wanted the cause understood before the remedy was applied. He spoke about the building the way a person spoke about something they had been thinking about for a long time. He did not explain why he had bought it. Serena asked 3 questions. 2 were technical. 1 was not. She asked what outcome he would consider a failure. He paused, which was the first sign that the question had. Then he said, "A building that looks whole but isn't." She wrote something on the legal pad in front of her. Daniel, who had learned to read her silences, said nothing. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When Everett Lane left, Daniel looked at Serena and said, with the studied neutrality of a man who knew better than to editorialize, that the project budget was significant. She said she knew. He said the client was apparently particular. She said she'd noticed. He said he thought she should lead it. She said she'd think about it, which was the thing she said when she had already decided. She thought about it for 3 days, which meant she did not think about Everett Lane, but thought extensively about Aldenmore. She pulled county records, historical surveys, photographs from the Tennessee State Library and Archives. The estate had been built in 1847 by a family named Aldred Agricultural Wealth, the particular kind that persisted through generations by never overreaching and had passed through for subsequent ownership, each leaving its own sediment of addition and alteration on the original structure. The east wing had been extended in 1912. The kitchen outbuilding had been partially collapsed by a tree fall in 1989 and imperfectly stabilized by a contractor who had, apparently, misunderstood which walls were structural. She recognized the misunderstanding immediately. Aldenmore was not a beautiful ruin in the romantic sense. It was a building that had survived things it probably shouldn't have survived: fire, neglect, water intrusion. The well-intentioned errors of people who thought they were helping was still standing. Not triumphantly, not gracefully, just standing. She understood that intimately. And the understanding arrived in her chest in a way that bypassed professional detachment entirely. She called Daniel on the 3rd evening and said she would take the project. He said Lane had asked specifically whether she would be willing to relocate to Franklin for the duration. She said she was. She did not tell herself it was because of the client. That was important. She told herself it was because of the building, which was true. She told herself it was because the restoration presented genuine intellectual challenges that the smaller projects she had been taking wouldn't provide, which was also true. She told herself she was ready to take on something of this scale again, which she believed, most of the time. Emerging from the tunnel like a sentence that had been building for a long paragraph before finally arriving at its verb, it was large and battered and completely serious. Federal style, which meant symmetry as a moral position. 5 bays across the facade. The center bay projected slightly. A fan light above the entrance door that had lost 2 of its original glazing bars. The brick was original, hand-pressed. The kind of variation in color and texture that modern reproduction could approximate but never quite replicate, because it required the specific combination of local clay and 19th century kill temperatures and 2 centuries of weathering to achieve its precise quality. The east wing extension from 1912 was visible in the change of brick, coursing a different bond pattern, a slightly warmer tone, like a sentence that had changed voices midway through. She stood in the drive for 5 minutes before going inside. She always did this with significant buildings. She wanted to understand what the building looked like before she knew what was wrong with it, because the damage was almost never the truest thing about a structure. And if you led with the damage, you risked missing the original intention entirely. Then she went inside and began to understand what was wrong with it. Everett Lane arrived at 10 o'clock, as scheduled. He walked through the rooms behind her while she asked precise questions, and did not attempt small talk, which she found immediately and unreasonably restful. She had spent 18 months bracing for the social labor of being in professional proximity to people who wanted things from her that had nothing to do with the work. And his complete focus on the work itself felt, in those first hours, like setting down something heavy she had been carrying so long, she had stopped noticing its weight. She told him about the wall he wanted removed, a full-height partition between what had been the library and the morning room, which he envisioned as a single large space, was, she explained, not a partition in the conventional sense. She had gotten under the subfloor that morning and found that it sat directly above a grade beam that was doing critical work. Removing it without comprehensive underpinning would destabilize the east wing entirely. The eastern exterior wall, already compromised by decades of water infiltration at the foundation, was relying on the load transferred through that interior wall to maintain its position. Without it, the whole assembly would begin to move. She used the word catastrophic. He didn't argue. He didn't suggest she was being conservative, which in her experience was what clients did when they heard something they didn't want to hear and couldn't dispute technically. He looked at the wall for a long time, then looked at her and said, "What's the solution?" she told him. He listened. He asked follow-up questions that were structurally sophisticated enough that she revised her initial assessment of how much he understood about buildings upward. He doubled her contract rate the following morning. He framed it as compensating for the increased scope of work. She accepted it without negotiation, which she would not have done a year earlier, and which she recognized as a form of self-respect she was still learning to sustain. The rhythm of Aldenmore established itself within 2 weeks. She arrived at the site by 7:30, before the tradespeople, and spent the first hour in the kind of focused solitude that restoration work required, that forensic intimacy with the building's history, reading the evidence of previous interventions in the way you read a text that had been edited by multiple hands. The contractors arrived at 8. Everett Lane arrived, on the days he came, which were 3 or 4 days a week, by mid-morning, and they walked the site together for an hour, reviewing progress, discussing problems, making decisions. Their professional relationship was exquisitely tense in a way that had nothing to do with attraction, or rather, had to do with something that felt more fundamental. They were intellectually matched in a way that she had not experienced professionally in years, and she suspected not often. He pushed back on her assessments when he had reason to, and not when he didn't. When she explained something technical, he absorbed it rather than performing absorption, and the difference was palpable. When she was wrong twice in the first month, once on a dating assessment and once on a material specification, he noted it without emphasis, just as a correction delivered neutrally into the conversation, and moved on. She found she trusted him for. He lived in a house he was renting in Franklin proper during the Restoration period. A Victorian frame house on a side street near the town square that he described, the one time she asked about it, as adequate. She had the impression that he lived generally in a state of provisional arrangement, that permanence, for him, was something he approached at an angle, never quite hidden. He had furniture he had clearly selected for function rather than comfort. She gathered, and books in stacks rather than shelves, and a kitchen he used primarily for coffee. She asked. One afternoon in late October when they were assessing the carriage house and the conversation had drifted in the way it occasionally did, when they had been talking about practical things for several hours and the practical things had temporarily run out, whether he had always been interested in historic preservation or whether Alden Moore was an anomaly. He was quiet for a moment, in the way she had learned meant he was deciding something rather than constructing an answer. My brother loved old buildings, he said. I didn't pay attention to why when he was. I'm paying attention now. She didn't ask about the brother. He didn't offer more. They went back to the carriage house, but something had shifted in the proportion of the conversation. A load-bearing element made visible, and neither of them remarked on it, which was, she was beginning to understand exactly how Everett Lane communicated the things that mattered to him. Obliquely, in passing, as though meaning were something to be glimpsed rather than handed over directly. Walking to her car at 5 o'clock, under the bare October oaks, that she would need to be careful about that. She thought it again the next morning. She stopped thinking it sometime in November, which was the first sign. In November, the light came late and left early, and the mornings at Alden Moore had a quality she had no exact word for. Not quite silence, not quite stillness. Something between the two that felt almost ceremonial. As though the building was in the process of becoming itself before the day's work dismantled and reassembled it. She had begun arriving at 7 rather than 7:30, not because the work required it, but because she liked the estate in those 45 minutes before the crews arrived. Liked the particular quality of being the only person on 12 acres of ground that had been continuously inhabited for over a century and three-quarters, and now stood, briefly, between occupants. Everett started arriving at 7:15, sometime in mid-November. She noticed, but didn't comment. He made coffee in the kitchen of the main house, which had been stabilized but not yet renovated, using a French press he kept in a cabinet and beans he brought from a roaster in Franklin. He made enough for two without asking. She accepted a cup without thanking him for it, which she realized afterward was the most honest thing she had done with another person in receiving something without the social friction of gratitude, just the simple acknowledgement of need. They drank coffee on the back porch in the November mornings and looked at the land behind the house, a sloping meadow that ran down to a bend in the Duck River. The water low in November, silver-brown, moving quickly in the cold. She had begun to understand that Alden Moore was not just a restoration project for him in the way that it was, despite everything, becoming more than a restoration project for her. There was something he was working out here, something private and ongoing that the building was serving as the site for, and she recognized it, without being able to name it because it was the same thing she was doing. They were both using Alden Moore as a place to survive something. She didn't say this to him. She filed it instead in the load-bearing section of her understanding of him and built over it carefully. The way you built over a buried structural element, always aware it was there, always accounting for the additional weight. The conversation happened in March, on a night when they had worked late because a problem had emerged with the original pine flooring in the upstairs hallway, a section of subfloor that had been improperly sistered at some point and was flexing in a way that threatened the surface board. They had been at it since 3 o'clock. She and two of the carpenters, and by 9 the carpenters had gone home, and she was still in the hallway because she needed to verify the extent of the problem before she could specify the repair, and she did not like leaving problems unspecified overnight if she could avoid it. Everett had stayed. Not visibly, not intrusively. He had been working at the folding table he kept in the adjacent room, going through documents of his own, and she had been aware of him the way she was always aware of him in shared spaces now, as a kind of baseline presence that did not require management. Sometime around 9 he came into the hallway and sat on the floor against the opposite wall, and they were both there in the half-finished space with its exposed brick and its bare Edison bulbs strung on temporary wire. The pine boards lifted in a 3-foot section, the smell of old wood and plaster, and something indefinably old in the air. She told him about the miscarriage. She didn't plan it and couldn't explain it afterward except to say that the combination of the space and the hour and the specific quality of his presence, still undemanding, containing no expectation of performance, created something she hadn't experienced since Chicago. The feeling that she could say a true thing and not have it She said it simply, without setup, the way you stated a structural fact, that she had been pregnant when Dominic left, that she had not been able to, that she had miscarried alone in January in an apartment with broken heating, and that she had told no one. She said it all in approximately 40 seconds. Everett did not say he was sorry. He did not say that he couldn't imagine. He did not reach over to touch her arm or produce the face that people produced when they were managing their own discomfort at proximity to another person's grief. He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be genuine rather than calculated, and then he said, "I had a son, lived for 4 days." She looked at him across the unfinished floor and understood. In the particular way you understood the structural logic of a building once you'd seen what it had been built to bear. That this was not a reciprocal disclosure, not an exchange of equal confessions, not the social mechanics of vulnerability being matched and returned. It was something else. It was the specific kind of honesty that happened between two people who had both learned, through different and separate catastrophes, that most of what passed for intimacy was actually performance, and that real proximity required something more than the willingness to appear vulnerable. It required the willingness to be seen by someone who was not going to make your grief smaller by absorbing it into their own narrative. The silence after that was the most honest thing either of them had experienced. Neither of them moved for a long time. The Edison bulbs hummed. Somewhere in the walls, the old house settled. She thought about all the things that had been built into that silence. His son, her pregnancy, Dominic, Chicago, the Pilsen apartment in January. Whatever had happened to Everett in Savannah that he had not yet spoken about and might not for a long time, and she thought that the silence could hold all of it, that it was structurally sufficient, that you didn't need to resolve everything that had been placed into a space for the space to support it. She stayed another hour. He didn't ask her to leave. She didn't ask permission to remain. When she finally stood and gathered her, he said, without looking up from the floor, that he thought the subfloor could be sistered properly with a full replacement of the affected section rather than a patch. She said she'd already been thinking the same thing. She drove back to her rental in Franklin through the March dark and felt, for the first time in 18 months, something that was not grief and not clarity and not the particular hypervigilance of a person who has learned to keep their load-bearing walls private. She felt cautiously and without any drama, accompanied. She was careful about the feeling. She was careful in the specific way she had learned to be careful about anything not suppressing the wanting, but not accelerating it either. Not building on an unverified foundation. She would need to know the soil conditions before she started going up. She noticed, in the weeks following March, that Everett withheld in ways she could map only partially. There were phone calls he took in another room, not urgently, not furtively, but consistently away from her, a pattern rather than an incident. There were trips to Savannah, twice in April, that he mentioned without explaining, noting only that he would be back by Thursday, by Sunday, as though the destination were incidental information rather than the kind of context that might illuminate the shape of his life. There was a study on the second floor of Aldenmore, its door fitted with a lock that was not original to the building, that she had never been invited into and had never pressed about. She told herself it was not her business. She was his architect. The personal dimensions of what had developed between them, the mornings on the back porch, the March hallway, the specific frequency at which they had learned to communicate, the way he looked at her when she said something that surprised him, with an expression that was less pleasure than recognition. None of that made his locked, study her business, or his Savannah trips her narrative. She was wrong to tell herself that. She understood this dimly, in the place where structural knowledge lived rather than conscious thought. in the way you understood that a building's omissions told you as much about its integrity as its visible elements, but she filed the knowledge in the load-bearing section and built over it again. Because what was between them was real, and she was not ready, yet, to look at what might be beneath it. April arrived. The carriage house stabilization was complete. The main house east wing was holding its newly underpinned wall with a solidity that satisfied her deep. The way only structural problems correctly solved could satisfy her. Aldenmore was becoming something. She could see it, the way she could see finished buildings and incomplete structures. Had always been able to, not imagination but spatial extrapolation, a reading of existing conditions toward their logical completion. She was happy at Aldenmore in a way she hadn't been happy anywhere in 2 years. And the happiness frightened her exactly as much as she would expect it to. Then she went to the Franklin County Historical Archive, and the floor opened up. She had gone to the Franklin County Historical Archive on a research errand that was entirely routine. She needed to verify the original site survey from 1847, which contained information about the placement of the kitchen outbuilding relative to the main house that would confirm or complicate the drainage solution she had designed for the Eastside Foundation. Historical archives were, in her experience, uniformly underfunded and therefore housed in conditions of endearing material chaos, documents in folders and boxers on shelves that were themselves records of whoever had organized them and when. And the when mattered because the organization of an archive told you almost as much about the institution as the documents themselves. She found the 1847 survey. She also found, in the same folder, misfiled or simply shelved adjacently by proximity of subject matter, the chain of title for the Aldenmore property going back to its original patent. She read it the way she read structural documents, systematically, from the beginning, each transaction in sequence. She was not looking for anything except the 1847 survey. She was not looking for the thing she found. Aldenmore had been sold. Under apparent financial duress, given the timeline and the recorded consideration, 14 months ago, not 5 years ago, as Everett had told her. The discrepancy was not a rounding error or an approximation. It was a 4-year gap, which was not the kind of gap produced by carelessness. Under a holding company called Meridian Blue Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware, the seller, a Tennessee subsidiary of a Chicago-based private equity firm. The firm's name was Hargrove Axiom. She sat with this for 30 seconds. Then she sat with it for 5 minutes. Then she went to the reference desk and asked to use the archive's computer terminal. And she spent 2 hours pulling every document that was available to her. Title records, corporate filings, property transfer instruments, anything that could be accessed through the state's public records databases. The picture that assembled itself was not a coincidence. It was a structure, and she was an expert in reading structures. Everett Lane and Dominic Hargrove had been in a financial war for 4 years. This was not the kind of war that appeared in business journalism or generated press releases, because both men operated through the same mechanism: quiet, legal, surgical, untraceable to intent. The war had a specific origin point that she found documented in a 2019 SEC filing and a subsequent civil complaint that had been settled before trial. Terms undisclosed. In 2019, Hargrove Axiom had acquired a biotech firm called Crestline Genomics during what had been characterized publicly as a voluntary strategic merger. The civil complaint told a different story. Fabricated allegations of intellectual property theft, deployed selectively through regulatory channels, to create the conditions under which the founders would accept a forced sale at suppressed valuation. The co-founder of Crestline Genomics, who had owned the specific patents at the center of the IP allegation, was a man named Cole Lane of Savannah, Georgia, Everett's younger brother. The civil complaint had been filed by Cole's estate. Cole Lane had died by suicide 8 months after the acquisition, financially destroyed, and the complaint alleged, though the settled terms meant this was never adjudicated, deliberately humiliated, through a pattern of professional defamation that extended beyond the acquisition into the broader biotech industry. She read this part of the document twice. She read it the way she read structural failure reports, carefully, looking for the load path that had led to the collapse. understanding that collapse was never a single event, but always the cumulative consequence of stresses, applied over time to a structure whose capacity had been gradually exceeded. Everett had spent 4 years methodically dismantling Dominic's hold, not loudly, not through litigation that would draw attention, through the same mechanisms Dominic used: acquisitions, financial pressure, the quiet deployment of capital through intermediary entities to create conditions that forced asset sales at adverse terms. Aldenmore had been one of those assets, a Tennessee property that had been held by a Hargrove subsidiary as part of a real estate portfolio that Everett had been systematically liquidating by acquiring the debt positions on those properties and calling them. Aldenmore was a recovered asset, a reclamation. She understood this. And then she found the document about herself. It was in the locked study, which she had not broken into and had not been invited into. She found it because Everett had left the study unlocked on a Wednesday morning in late April. She was certain, as she stood in the doorway looking at the room for the first time, that the unlocking had not been accidental. She had known Everett Lane for 7 months by then, and she did not believe he did anything accidentally. She believed he made choices and calibrated the timing of their consequence. The study was bare in the way that spoke of intensive use rather than emptiness. A drafting table, a laptop, stacks of documents in the particular ordered density of who worked with paper rather than screens when the thinking was serious. A map of Hargrove Axiom's asset structure pinned to one wall, color-coded with the system she understood immediately because it was the same system she used to track. Restoration phases: red for active intervention, green for completed, yellow for pending. Most of the holdings on the map were green or yellow. In the center of the drafting table was a single manila folder. Inside it was a document that had been assembled with care. A dossier, though she didn't think of it that way at first because she didn't want to think of it that way. It contained a copy of the divorce filing from Cook County, a copy of the LLC transfer document for the Wicker Park townhouse, the document she had signed without reading, records indicating the blacklisting of Callaway Design, traced back to communications originating from Hargrove Axiom's legal department, the prenuptial agreement, specifically the clause regarding intellectual property developed during the marriage, a clause Dominic's attorneys had used to seize her portfolio of restoration documentation in design archives, and at the bottom, a single handwritten note on plain paper in Everett's handwriting, dated 18 months ago, which read, S.C. Pilsen, leverage with no knowledge of leverage, ideal position. She stood in the doorway of the study for a long time. She did not go in. She did not touch the folder. She stood at the threshold and understood, with the cold and complete lucidity of structural failure recognition, exactly what she had been intending: a weapon. Dominic Hargrove's wound, walking, a living proof of what the man destroyed. Deployable at the moment of maximum consequence, a public perhaps a court case, a piece of narrative leverage that could be used to demonstrate a pattern of behavior that would otherwise exist only in corporate documents. She was supposed to be the human face of what Everett was doing, the thing that made the abstract financial destruction into a story. She stood there for 7 minutes by the clock on the study wall. Then she drove to her rental, packed a bag, and drove 8 hours south to Savannah. She arrived at the Lane family estate on Abercorn Street at 6:50 in the morning, when the Savannah air was thick with the specific quality of a coastal spring morning, warm and heavy, azaleas in the garden at the peak of their bloom, the Spanish moss in the live oaks moving in a slow, negligent way that was nothing like the urgent movement of Chicago trees. She let herself through the gate, which was unlocked, and sat in his kitchen. The kitchen of the Abercorn Street house was old and well-used and serious, with a long pine table and windows looking out onto a garden that had been tended for a very long time by people who understood what they were doing. She sat at the table and waited. She did not rehearse what she was going to say. She had nothing to rehearse because she had nothing to perform. She only had what was true. He came downstairs at 7:15. He was in a white linen shirt and he was barefoot, which was the first time she had seen him barefoot, and the detail landed with an unexpected force. The smallness of it, the domesticity, the way it reduced the space between the version of him she had come to know and the version she had discovered in the document. He stopped when he saw her. He did not look surprised. She had expected that. She told him what she had found. She did it without tears, without theater. In the same voice she used to tell clients about load-bearing walls measured, specific, not without weight but not performed either. She told him about the archive, the chain of title, the 4-year timeline she had reconstructed. She told him about the document in the study. She told him she understood now the architecture of it, what she had been positioned to be, and where she had been positioned in the larger structure of what he was doing. She told him she understood all of it. That was the worst part, she said. She understood all of it, and she still felt, somewhere beneath you, the specific grief of a thing you had believed in finding out. It was built on a calculation. He didn't deny it. He sat down across from her at the pine table and was quiet for a moment that she recognized she had come to recognize his silences, the way she recognized load-bearing elements, by their function. This silence was not evasion. It was not the silence of someone deciding how to manage a disclosure. It was the silence of someone deciding whether to say the truest thing they knew how to say, which was harder than the thing everyone assumed was hardest. He said, I identified you in Pilsen. I knew about the blacklisting and the LLC and the prenuptial clause. I knew about the miscarriage. She didn't move. He said, I walked into the conference room at Breyer and Hollis with a plan. The plan was to use your experience of Dominic's methods as corroborating testimony documenting of a pattern, in a human voice. At the moment when the financial dismantling was reaching its conclusion and would require a public narrative to prevent Dominic from repositioning himself as the victim of a hostile takeover, you were supposed to be the context, the evidence that this was not just that it was people. He paused. He said, somewhere in the fall, when you told me that the wall I wanted to remove was the only thing holding the East Wing together, I understood that the plan had already become irrelevant, and that I had not found a way to tell you that, and that the longer I didn't find a way, the more I was choosing not to. He said, I left the document where you could find it because I could not keep lying to the only person in 4 years who made me feel the specific weight of being known. That is not an excuse. It is a confession. I understand that you may not find it sufficient. The morning light off the marsh was coming through the kitchen windows in that slow Savannah way, amber and patient. Nothing like Chicago light. Nothing like Chicago anything. She looked at his hands on the pine table. She had known his hands for 7 months. Capable, careful, the hands of someone who handled things they valued with appropriate attention. She thought about the March hallway, and his son who had lived for 4 days in the specific quality of his silence in the moments that mattered. She thought about herself, which she had learned, in the past 2 years, to do with some accuracy. She said, there is something I have never told anyone. He waited. In the particular way he waited. Not with patience as a strategy, but with patience as a substance, something solid and present that didn't require her to fill it. She said, on the night I miscarried in Pilsen, I called Dominic. Once, from a blocked number, he answered. I listened to his voicemail greeting his actual voice, 3 seconds of it, before the message ended, and I hung up. And in those 3 seconds I understood something that I had been trying to understand for 2 months, which was that I didn't want him to come. I didn't want to be rescued. I didn't want comfort from the person who had caused the situation. What I wanted, the only thing I actually wanted, on that floor, in January, in that bathroom, was for someone to know that it had happened. Not to fix it. Not to take the grief away. Just to know. A witness. That's all I needed. She looked at him. She said, that's what you were supposed to be. A witness. And you still are one. You've been one since October. You just lied about why you showed up. The silence that followed that was different from all the other silences. It had a different load capacity. It could hold more. He said her name. Just that. And the way he said it quietly, as though it were a specific thing he was being careful with, was the most directly she had ever heard him speak. She said she needed time. He said he understood. She said she did not mean time from him, necessarily. She meant time with what she now knew. Time to put the knowledge into the structure of everything she had built since Chicago and see whether the structure could hold it. She said she had become very good at knowing which walls to keep. He said, I know you have. I've been watching you for a long time. She drove back to Franklin that afternoon. She did not stop in the middle of the drive and turn around. She did not call him. She drove through the Georgia flatlands and into the Tennessee hills and arrived at her rental in Franklin at 11 o'clock at night and sat in her car for a while before going in. Looking at the dark, she thought about Cole Lane, who had co-founded something he believed in and had it taken from him by a mechanism designed to be untraceable. She thought about Everett, who had spent 4 years building a reclamation project out of the architecture of his grief. She thought about Dominic, who had been precise in his destruction and had never once understood that precision was not the same as complete, that what he left undone in people had consequence. He couldn't calculate because he didn't believe in the load-bearing properties of what he dismissed as sentiment. She thought about herself. She thought about load-bearing walls. She thought, yes, but also he knew. And also, that is not nothing. And also, you have rebuilt before. 3 months after Savannah, in July, Dominic Hargrove's majority stake in Hargrove Axiom was acquired in a hostile leveraged buyout. The mechanics of the acquisition were complex. Multiple layers of holding companies, debt instruments, originated in 3 different states. A consortium of investors whose individual positions were each too small to trigger disclosure requirements, but whose collective purchase was, in the aggregate, the kind of transaction that changed a man's life. It was legal, utterly. It was surgical, completely. It was, to anyone who understood the architecture of financial instrument, the work of someone who had learned from the best and applied the lesson without mercy, deep in the legal paperwork, in the representation and warranty agreements schedule of investors, was a holding company registered in Franklin, Tennessee, called Aldenmore Preservation Partners, LLC. Its listed manager was S. Calloway. She had asked to be included. He had made it possible. They had not discussed it extensively because it had not required discussion. It was in the logic of what they had both been building, structurally necessary. Dominic had taken her studio, her name on documents, her architecture. It was appropriate that her name be in the document that took from him the thing he had built his identity on, not revenge. Something more precise than that. Accounting. Dominic Hargrove did not go to... He did not appear in court. He did not become the subject of a public narrative that would have turned him, paradoxically, into the kind of figure people felt something about. He simply became smaller, divested of the platform that had made his particular brand of precision lethal, reduced to the scale of a man without leverage. For a man whose identity was leverage, this was not a punishment. It was an erasure. It was what he had done to her, returned to him in the currency he understood best. She felt, when she read the confirmation of the acquisition, less satisfaction than she expected. She felt mostly the clean sensation of a calculation resolved, a structural problem correctly diagnosed and correctly addressed. She filed it and moved on. She returned to Aldenmore in August. Not for Everett, not yet, not entirely, not with the uncomplicated wholeness of someone who had resolved everything. She returned because the East Wing restoration was unfinished, and she did not leave buildings half done. She had never done that, and she was not going to start because her personal life had complicated her professional one. That was not who she was. And knowing who you were, she had learned, was the most load-bearing thing a person could have. Everett was there when she arrived. He was standing on the back porch with coffee, 2 cups, and he handed her one without ceremony, without apology or explanation, or the kind of elaborate emotional staging that their situation might have seemed to require. They stood together and looked at the Duck River, which was high in August, green and moving. Nothing like the November silver she had first seen from this porch. He said, "I'm glad you came back. I told you. The East Wing isn't finished." He said he knew. They worked together through August and September in a way that was different from before. Not eased exactly, not softened, but more fully honest, which was better than ease. She had stopped carrying the weight of not knowing what she didn't know. He had stopped carrying the weight of what he hadn't said. What remained between them was what remained between 2 people. After the architecture of concealment is removed and you discover whether what was underneath was worth building on, it was not simply... Not without the specific texture of 2 people who had each survived something serious and carried the structural modifications that survival required, but real. The kind of real that didn't require performance or maintenance beyond the basic attention of honesty. On a morning in late September, he brought revised blueprints to the breakfast table on the back porch. The locked study redesigned, its walls open to the hallway and the adjacent room. No lock on the new door. She spread the blueprints on the table and looked at them with professional attention. "No more closed rooms," he said. She traced the new floor plan with her finger. She saw something. "You kept one load-bearing wall," he said. "Yes." She looked at the plan. The wall he had kept was interior. Non-obvious. Not a wall you'd notice if you weren't looking for the structural logic. Exactly the wall that needed to stay. "You taught me which ones matter." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had come to know. Less pleasure than recognition. Like hearing, in a new context, a phrase you had always known the meaning of, but had not heard spoken aloud before. She approved the revised blueprint. Aldenmore was completed in October. 11 months after she had first stood in the drive under the oak canopy and looked at it with professional eyes. The unveiling was modest. A gathering of the preservation community, local architects, the Franklin Historical Society, the contractors who had worked the site. There was Tennessee bourbon on a long table outside. The carriage house in the evening light came in low and gold through the restored windows of the main house and fell on the original pine floors with the specific quality of light through old glass. Slightly imperfect, warmer than modern glazing produced. She walked through the rooms alone, before the guests arrived, which she did with every building she finished. This was her private accounting, a final structural assessment, but also something less technical and more intimate. She looked at what had been here when she arrived, what it had become under her hands, and she tried to understand what had been gained and what had been necessarily lost in the translation from ruin to restoration. The best restorations always lost something. That was not a failure of the work. That was the work being honest about the nature of Aldenmore had lost its particular quality of abandonment that haunted, suspended time quality of a building mid-collapse that some people found beautiful in photographs, but that was, in reality, a form of ongoing damage. It had gained something harder to name. The quality of a building that remembered everything it had survived and had been given the structural resources to keep surviving. The bones were original. The repairs were visible where they needed to be visible, matched where matching served the building better than contrast. The east wing wall stood, underpinned, solid. The carriage house was stabilized, its collapsed section rebuilt in materials that read as new against the old, not concealed, just completed. The locked study, now open, had been repointed and given new oak floors that complemented rather than matched the original pine of the hallways. One wall remained. The load-bearing wall, which she had specified in limestone plaster and left unadorned. It looked, to the uninitiated, like a design choice. To her, it looked like the truth. A writer from a local preservation journal was there that evening, and in the article published 2 weeks later, she described Aldenmore as a masterwork of structural honesty, a building that remembered everything. It survived and refused to hide any of it. She wrote that the restoration had achieved something rare in preservation work, a legible history, where every repair told you something true about what had needed repairing, rather than pretending the damage had never occurred. Serena clipped the article. She looked at it for a moment. In the morning, at the oak table in the Aldenmore kitchen, she did not frame it. She did not post it or send it to anyone. She slid it across the table to Everett, who was sitting across from her with his coffee. The morning light coming through the restored windows in the slow, patient, southern way she had come to depend on more than she had anticipated. He read it twice. The second time, more slowly. She watched him read it the way she watched people interact with buildings she had restored, looking for the moment of recognition, the point at which the work reached them as something more than structure. She saw it. He set the article down on the table and was quiet for a moment. He said, "This is the most accurate description of you I have ever read." She looked at him. She said, "I know. They did not sign anything. Not yet." That was important. The not yet? It was not hesitation, not unresolved ambiguity, not the emotional equivalent of an underpinned wall waiting to see if the soil would move. It was deliberate. They were both people who had learned the cost of signing things without reading them. And they were both people who had come to understand that the most significant structures were the ones you built in sequence. Load-bearing walls first, each element confirmed before the next was placed. Nothing cosmetic applied until the structural integrity was verified. Alden Moore stood. That was not a small thing. Buildings that had survived what Alden Moore had survived a century, and 3/4 of use and misuse, of fires and floods, and the well-intentioned errors of people who thought they were helping, of being abandoned, and then, worst of all, being partially saved by someone who didn't understand which walls to keep such buildings, did not stand without accounting for every stress they had absorbed. The restoration had made that accounting visible. It had said, here is what happened, and here is what held, and here is what we rebuilt, and what we left on it. Outside, the October light moved through the oak canopy the way it had on the morning she arrived, filtered, golden, slow. The Duck River was lower now than in August, returning to its autumn depth, moving in the deliberate way of rivers that knew their own course. She slid the article back across the table. He moved it to the side, making space for the coffee cup, for the morning, for whatever was next. The silence between them was not an absence. It was a door, standing open. It was an east wing, load-bearing wall confirmed, ready for what came after. It was Alden Moore in October, restored, honest, standing. It was enough. It was, for the first time in a long time, more than enough. And neither of them was going anywhere.